You're right, folks, and welcome back. Cataclysm is the last expansion, at least until more recent times, where legendaries can be considered legendary, and not just annoyingly overpowered epics with delusions of grandeur, which are available to anyone with a foresight enough to start the damn quest chain. In vanilla, there was Thunder Fury, Sulphurous, and Atiesh. TBC brought with it the highly sought-after warglaives from Illidan, as well as Thoradal, and Wrath introduced Valanir and Shadowmourne. How these items were acquired varied somewhat. For vanilla legendaries, there was an element of the rare drop, bindings, Eye of Sulphurous, etc., with some crafting and questing attached. TBC was much more basic, kill boss and cross your fingers when you loot it. But Wrath favoured the idea of semi-frequent drops mixed with a questing element. But this was exemplified most of all with Shadowmourne, where the first couple of quests are dedicated to creating the base epic item, and subsequent quests revolve around you empowering and upgrading said item to its legendary form. There was some tweaking for classic, but the foundations remained. You can argue which method is best in the comments. Personally, I prefer the Wrath style of things, where the item in question is still fairly unique and only available to a select few classes and specs, and is pretty bloody powerful because of that, but the acquisition is not entirely RNG dependent and can be worked towards each and every reset instead of just hoping beyond hope that the shiny orange makes an appearance on the boss's corpse. It's always a bit disheartening when little Jimmy Noob gets lucky drop, whereas the long time players who clear a raid week in and week out don't even see it, let alone win it. And yeah, I know that's how loot works in WoW, but legendaries are just different. They should be an almighty status symbol, not a roll of the dice. Cataclysm legendaries stick with the Wrath of the Lich King format, a quest chain mixed with drops from raid bosses and a gold cost for items to either make the base weapon or just to progress in the chain in some way, with the focus being on creating and empowering an item stage by stage. So, with that said, let's take a look at the shiny oranges your guildies are going to be bare-knuckle brawling over in the upcoming expansion. Now, I'm not going to go over each and every quest in each stage. I will leave relevant links to handy little guides down below because, Christ, they're long. But maybe if you're lucky, I'll go over these chains a bit more in-depth when the respective raids are on the horizon. First up then, you have Dragonwrath, Terragosa's Rest. This is a caster staff available to warlocks, druids, mages, shamans, and priests, which crops up in the Firelands patch. Now make no mistake, this is a DPS item, so if a healer tries to make a case for it, throw something very large and very heavy at them. It'll be like a DPSer trying to make a case for Valanir in Ulduar. Yeah, alright, the stats might be pretty nice, but the unique effect is what sells it. In the case of Dragonwrath, that effect is the Wrath of Terragosa. When dealing damage, you have a chance to duplicate the harmful spell that triggered the proc. This works for direct damage or damage over time spells, so dot specs like your Afflictions or Shadows will still be able to make good use of it. At the time, this item was designed in such a way as to benefit dot specs just as much as their direct damage counterparts, and to try and minimise the idea that it should go to a certain spec first due to them making the theoretical most out of the item, though I'm sure someone will still work out the best spec to use it come Cataclysm. And with that in mind, but I would say this with any legendary, my advice would be to give it to the most worthy individual and not necessarily the flavour of the month who might be able to nuke a boss into oblivion under the right circumstances. If you've got a long-standing Boomkin or Shadow Priest in your guild, they show up each and every week, kick ass, take names, don't make a fuss, and are generally wicked people, probably best give it to them over the Warlock whining in the corner that all the other guilds are furnishing their purple wizards with orange staffs, and that he should get it as a result, despite being your raid team's resident floor inspector. And this item will be attainable in both 10 and 25 man, so no need to panic if you're in a 10-man guild and fancy your chances at a legendary. However, some things to note. There is a hell of a lot of grinding in a chain like this. It's only natural. And in most cases where you need to collect an item from a raid boss, the amount you can earn per kill will change depending on the size and difficulty of the raid itself. So in most cases, 10-man normal will grant fewer seething cinders and smouldering essences, which are just a couple of the things you need to collect for Dragonwrath, than 25-man heroic. Now that does make sense in the grand scheme of things, but I do have a feeling it will be slightly different this time round. If you didn't know, in Wrath, Blizzard altered how the Shadowmoon chain works slightly. Originally, you could only loot Shadowfrost shards, the legendary material if you will, once someone in the raid was actually on that part of the quest, and the drop rate differed between normal and heroic. In Classic, this was changed so that the shards dropped from the get-go, regardless of whether or not someone was actually on the correct quest, and the normal drop rate was also brought in line with the heroic. This, along with the fact that at least 5 shards were now guaranteed per week from a full clear, it greatly reduced the amount of time taken to acquire the axe, and given that Wrath Classic's final patch isn't going to be around for as long as the original, it makes plenty of sense. So with that change in mind, and the fact Blizzard have made it very clear that we are going to see an increased content cadence with Cataclysm, it is likely that these differing drop rates and whatnot will be amended, so that if they're not identical across the board for all raid sizes and difficulties, at the very least the normal rates of both raid sizes will probably be in line with their heroic counterparts. And much like Shadowmoon, this weapon will come in distinct stages, but whereas the axe only had 2, the epic Shadow's Edge followed by the legendary at the end of the chain, Dragonwrath instead comes in 3 forms, and the quest chain is separated into 3 distinct stages because of this. The first stage is the Branch of Nordrassil, an epic quality staff equivalent to normal Firelands loot. The second is the Rune Staff of Nordrassil, equivalent to heroic loot. And then the third and final, the Big Orange itself. This means that you could, in theory, have multiple casters working towards different stages of the staff at the same time. So once the guy who's first in line has completed stage 1 and is working away on stage 2, you can have someone else start picking up the items for stage 1. So whilst you might have an order in your guild, being second or third doesn't mean you've got to wait a couple of months for the bloke in front of you to complete it in its entirety. But once you've got it, like near enough every legendary ever, you won't have to worry about a new weapon for the rest of the expansion. And as a bonus with this one, you get to turn into a big bastard dragon, which as far as legendary perks go, that's pretty up there. We've then got the second and final legendary of Cataclysm, the Fangs of the Father. Now, this legendary is only available to rogues in the Dragon Soul patch, so unlike Dragonwrath, you're not going to have a handful of different classes cracking each other over the head with steel chairs. But with that being said, if you've got a few rogues in the roster, someone's morning tea is probably going to get poisoned, but the decision on who gets this legendary should be a bit easier than the staff, in all fairness. Much like Dragonwrath, these daggers come in 3 stages. The first one is Fear and Vengeance, a set equal to normal Dragon Soul loot, the Sleeper and the Dreamer, the heroic equivalents, and then naturally Golad and Tyriosh, the legendaries. And the beats to how this legendary is acquired are actually very similar to Dragonwrath. 3 distinct stages, as I mentioned, with a new and improved version of the daggers at the end of each stage. There's also a hell of a lot of collecting and grinding, and not too unnoticeable gold cost here and there, as well as some pretty substantial single-player lore malarkey going on with Rathian. It's actually a pretty fun experience for any rogue, so definitely worth a crack if you can. And a lot of what I said for the caster staff also applies here, as there might be some tweaks to the items you need to collect in the raid itself, i.e. the Elementium gem clusters, because for the second stage of the chain you need to collect 333 shadowy gems, which are found within these clusters, and these clusters drop from bosses, and in their original incarnation the amount of clusters and subsequently gems you can get are lower on 10 man than 25, but there is no difference between normal or heroic, so again, I imagine we'll see some alterations to the drop rates across the board, similar to Shadowmoon. But it is unlikely, however, that with this legendary you will have multiple rogues working towards the daggers through different stages at the same time, as might be the case with Dragonwrath. Reason being, whereas there are different items or resources or quest objectives that need to be fulfilled, with them all being doable at the exact same time with Dragonwrath, the gem clusters I mentioned are required in the third stage as well as the second. This time, instead of opening them to get at the gems within, you just need to pick up 60 of the clusters themselves. This means that rogues on the second and third stages will require the same items to progress, so unless you want to slow down the progress of your current dagger recipient massively, Any other rogues in your roster won't get past the first stage until whoever's in front of them has finished the chain in its entirety, or at the very least is on the Kill Deathwing quest at the very end of it. This isn't as bad as it may seem. Whereas the caster staff can be used by every caster class in-game, and as such is something half of any active raid roster is going to want to get their hands on, being able to do 2 or 3 at any one time is actually quite handy. But since this item is a rogue-only affair, the restriction doesn't mean all that much. Realistically, you're going to have 1, 2, maybe 3 rogues at push in your roster, and it's likely in some 10-man teams that there isn't a rogue full stop. So assuming your guild isn't going through rogues like wet wipes in a brothel, the couple of yellows you do have in your team will inevitably get this legendary, assuming they want it, and bearing in mind that there is likely to be some sort of change to the speed at which the Fangs can be acquired, it really shouldn't take too long to outfit them with it. Let's have a look at the set bonus then. It's very reminiscent of Shadowmourne. All versions of the dagger have a chance for melee attacks to grant a stacking buff, Shadows of the Destroyer, which increases your agility, capping out at 50 stacks with the legendary version. That's pretty basic, but undoubtedly powerful. The real interesting aspect to this is the second part of the set bonus only available to the legendary variant. After 30 stacks, there is an increasing chance an application of the buff can proc a secondary buff called Fury of the Destroyer, which is just crackers. It grants 5 combo points immediately, and any finishing moves used during its 6-second duration also generate 5 combo points. So for this window, you're gonna be spamming a lot of finishing moves, which is just a little bit unholy. And there is one more thing to really mention regarding this legendary, and that is combat spec. Now, combat is the sword, axe, anything but dagger spec really, and that is no exception in Cataclysm. You'll be using bigger, meaner looking beating sticks from the get-go, so you might reckon that combat rogues are out of the running unless they just want to display the daggers on their mantelpiece. Not so! I'm sure your assassination rogues will be preparing a speech on the level of Braveheart as to why they should be the first recipients, and you know what, fair enough, dagger for the dagger rogues and all of that, but there is an equip bonus that means the Fangs are still viable for combat rogues. A 45% damage increase to sinister and revealing strikes, which obviously is a bit insane, and it should be on all versions of the dagger, meaning you don't have to wait for the big shiny orange ones before you can actually use them. So yeah, if you combat, do not fear, you're still in the running for a rather unsettling pair of tentacle daggers, should you fancy them. Anyway, I've prattled on for long enough. Like I said, I may take a more in-depth look at things nearer the relevant times for these items, but either way, if you are unsure as to what big shiny oranges rear their head at this expansion, now you know. And if you want to have a read of some handy guides, I will have them linked down below for your perusal. And I'm sorry if I sound a little bit knackered. It's a bit late in the day as I'm recording this, and I've been fending off yet another bastard cold the last fortnight or so. Hopefully I can start cracking things out a bit more regularly again, as it has been a bit slow the last week or so. But if you'd be so kind to like, sub, share with your pals and so on, that'd be grand. Have a good one, folks. Bye for now.